As much as I love old school games, the convenience afforded by wireless modern controllers is one of my favorite things about gaming today. And while we can buy controller extension cables for our consoles, that still leaves a long trip hazard between you and the Joy box you've got connected to the TV.
It's Freedom Stick, it's the #1 bet. It's got no wires, it's a one to get. Arcade action is where you'll be. Yeah, Freedom Stick will set you free. No wires.
Of course, when older consoles were new, there were a handful of wireless controllers, typically infrared style, requiring a line of sight with the receiver in order to function properly. And while those are pretty neat, I have to admit I've been looking for a more modern wireless solution for retro consoles. 8BitDo has a solution for the NES and SNES with their retro receiver units, which let you pair Bluetooth controllers that will map their controls to the consoles. On top of the receivers being pretty cheap, 8BitDo also produces a series of pretty decent Bluetooth controllers that, overall, I really like, though I've always found them a bit difficult to pair correctly with anything, including the receivers, at least during that initial setup. While 8BitDo has their solution for the Nintendo side of things, the Sega Genesis was the other system I really wanted a wireless controller for. Enter Krikzz, developer of the popular EverDrive brand of flash carts for various consoles, and their JOYZZ Sega Genesis 6-button wireless controller. Available from Krikz's website for $65 and shipped from their outfit in the Ukraine, the JOYZZ is a modern creation that sounded exactly like what I wanted in a wireless Genesis controller. So of course, I bought one. The JOYZZ arrives in a simple black box with no flare with the controller and the receiver. The controller charges over micro USB, and Krikzz touts the controller has up to 150 hours of gameplay with one charge of the 800 mAh battery. My initial impressions of the design were good, as the buttons felt really nice with a good mix of click and mush that fans of a Sega controller will feel familiar with. Even though I absolutely love the original 3-button Sega Genesis controller because of its heft and size, the weight and shape of the JOYZZ controller was pretty comfortable. The JOYZZ feels pretty comparable to the Hyperkin GN6, maybe with slightly less click in the buttons, but the Hyperkin controller is an excellent replacement for the stock Sega 6-button pad, and the JOYZZ feels like it fits right into that lineup. Of course, the big question is, how does it play? From my experience, the JOYZZ controller plays extremely well and accurately, with button responses and movement seeming to hit right on, but I do have to admit I'm not the most perceptive person to controller input lag. Krikzz claims the controller only has a response time of 2.7 milliseconds. I played a lot with the FrameMeister upscaling unit as well as the open source scan converter on my 4K TV, and even with those situations, everything seemed to be hitting pretty well. But I connected it to my PVM for that perfect CRT response, and it really hit it home for me that if there is additional input lag being created by a wireless controller, I'm not able to perceive it. So the JOYZZ seems to be doing just fine in that regard. The buttons do feel really nice, and though there aren't nearly as many 6-button Genesis games as I thought, all the ones I tried with the JOYZZ felt just as good as they would with other normal wired 6-button controllers I've used. The Hyperkin pad I mentioned before is really actually pretty great, but the pride of my oddball Genesis controller collection is this generic 6-button monster that I got at a convention last year. It really takes the cake for awful. Thankfully, the JOYZZ doesn't give me the impression it's going to have its buttons fall out if you shake it like this one does. The JOYZZ receiver feels a little weird and loose, but I've not had any trouble with it despite plugging and unplugging it over the past few weeks while testing the controller. Once paired with the receiver, the controller connects quickly with the tap of a button on the pad, and it does so really fast. I believe the speed of this connection is because the JOYZZ uses 2.4 GHz wireless to connect to the receiver, rather than a flavor of the Bluetooth protocol like some other receivers and controllers use. I've really enjoyed the convenience the JOYZZ has added to my Genesis playtime, and like you'd expect from a Sega Genesis controller, the device works with all the console's add-ons like the Sega CD, and it's even compatible with the original Sega Master System, and a special button combination allows the controller to work with SMS games that aren't typically compatible with a Genesis controller. This works with power-based converted SMS games, or if you use the receiver on an actual Sega Master System. Like other 6-button controllers, the JOYZZ can go into 3-button controller mode to work with a handful of Genesis games that don't tend to like 6-button controllers. This includes games like Golden Axe 2, which just doesn't seem to want to cooperate by default, and this does seem to work just fine while the gaming controller is running, as opposed to turning the game on and off while holding the mode button down like normal pads in my experience. Overall, I'm really happy with the JOYZZ controller. But there's an important thing to address. The Dpad is, well, it's a little off-kilter. It wasn't something I noticed directly at first, and I never noticed I was hitting the inputs weird or off or anything like that. I'm terrible at fighting games, keep that in mind as you watch this, but I was still able to do some special moves and a quick back and forth or diagonal movement. And I don't care what year a controller was released, but you shouldn't expect to get a crooked D-pad after you pay $65 for a controller. Krikzz has said that customers will receive replacement D-pads and that the issue is because of a manufacturing flaw of some kind. It's probably something like the mold of the D-pad was incorrect, but I do hope that these replacement D-pads will be included with new JOYZZ units shipped out after they address this problem. A user on Krikzz support forum mentioned replacing the D-pad of the JOYZZ with the D-pad of the Hyperkin GN6 controller we talked about earlier. The D-pad of the Hyperkin controller is pretty much the same size as the one on the JOYZZ, so I decided to give that a shot myself and swap them out. And sure enough, it's pretty easy to take apart the controller and remove the D-pad from one controller and exchange it with the other. I didn't notice a large difference at first, but the D-pad did feel like it moved more in line with how I expected a Genesis controller to move, not necessarily meaning that the inputs were any different, but just how it felt in my hand. And no, I don't think everyone has to do this. Harvesting a D-pad from another controller wasn't too difficult, but I don't really like the idea of, after you pay $65 for something, that you have to take it apart and fix it yourself. The other issue with the JOYZZ is purely cosmetic, but not one I expected. The paint for the Krikzz brand logo and the start button wore off far too easily. I've had the controller for a matter of weeks now, and I wore down the paint as if it was nothing but dirt and dust that needed to be cleaned off. Does this affect the performance of the controller? No, of course not. But again, like the D-pad, for $65, a customer hopes that the paint, however small, won't just wash away in no time. I've read that this affects the smoky translucent controller that I bought, as well as the black color option. But as of this video, I don't believe Krikzz has addressed that particular issue. Hopefully they do, because while a nitpick, I have to admit, it is a little annoying that a few swipes can remove the branding from anything. Despite the D-pad issue and the weirdness with the paint, I think the JOYZZ wireless controller is one of the best things to happen to the Genesis in a long time. The overall construction and feel of the controller is on par with other Sega controllers, the long battery life is great, and with more compatibility modes than a stock 6-button pad, the JOYZZ is easier to get working with troublesome games without much hassle. And thankfully it sounds like Krikzz is addressing some of the issues with the controller, and that's great to see. I love how many projects are being undertaken for retro consoles, and I really can't wait to see what's coming next for the retro gaming landscape. But for now, I'm really happy to finally be wireless with my Sega Genesis.